Good evening, everybody. I'm sure I really need this, but anyway, I will. Students. This college always loves to start with students first. Students. And I'm thrilled to see we've got presidents here as well. Students and presidents. Honoured guests, fellows, dear friends of the college, and particularly, I'm delighted to welcome Lady English, after whom this lecture is named. She is, or was, the 9th principal of the college and fulfilled a leading role at a time that the college made a very important decision to go mixed. And rather than me saying anything more about that time or how the lecture came to be, I'm going to pass the word on to our host for the evening, the immediate past Vice Principal, Dr. Georgina Paul, who will introduce our most honoured guest of this evening, Sarah Mukherjee MBE, and tell us what is going to happen. So thank you very much, and over to you, Georgina.
Very, very warm welcome to all of you from me too, honoured guests, fellow members of St Hilda's College, and a wave too to those in posterity who are going to watch the recording of this evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Lady English Lecture 2023, and I'm particularly proud to welcome our distinguished speaker and this year's Lady English Lecturer, Sarah Mukherjee MBE, Chief Executive of the IEMA. I've had to look up oddly often what the IEMA stands for. It sort of rolls off very easily. But Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment. I'm going to introduce Sarah properly shortly, but first of all would like to say a few words about the Lady English Lecture itself. Judith English, Lady English, was Principal of St Hilda's College from 2001 to 2007. And on her retirement as head of house, she set up a fund, the Lady English Fund, to support a series of lectures or seminars related to equality of opportunity, including but not limited to gender equality. Over the past 15 years, that fund has been used to support a student-run gender equality or latterly feminist festival, which takes place annually in the Hilary term, as well as, since 2013, an annual lecture, the Lady English Lecture, in which our guest lecturers are invited to talk from their specific perspective on a theme to do with equality or equality of opportunity. Now, these themes resonate with the college's commitment to excellence and equality. That is, our dedication as a college not just to the excellence in education and research for which Oxford University stands, our aspiration to be the very best in the world, but also to providing an equality of opportunity based on the conviction, and it is a deep conviction here, that excellence is to be achieved precisely through the diversity of our community, its accessibility to people of all kinds and of different backgrounds, beliefs and experiences, to whom the college becomes a home and a place of dialogue and exchange. And I would like once again, as I do, or have done for a number of years now, to thank, on behalf of the college, the many members, alumni and friends of St Hilda's who contributed to the Lady English Fund and whose generosity has enabled us to invite to the college an impressive sequence of speakers who have addressed the topic of equality in an intriguing variety of ways. Now, Sarah Mukherjee is one of our own. She read Jurisprudence at St Hilda's from 1984 to 1987, a very good era. And as the state school-educated daughter of a single mother living on a council estate in Essex before she came up to Oxford, has spoken of the life-transforming experience of the St Hilda's years. And I'm rather naughtily quoting from bits of correspondence that Sarah and I have had, which she hasn't given me permission to use, so she can clout me later. The confidence that an Oxford education brings, the ability to look people in the eye and not be intimidated, means you can be much more effective in what you try to achieve. Or again, getting into Oxford was transformative. Not only did I end up interacting with people that I, to be honest, didn't even know existed, I had my horizons broadened intellectually and academically in a way that I would not have thought possible. And that's exactly what we think the education this place is about. Sarah's first career step was working in PR at the House of Commons, and she's remarkably well informed about what's going on in government, which is a very interesting topic of conversation at dinner. And then she branched out from there into consultancy before answering the vocational call of journalism. She completed her diploma in journalism at the Polytechnic of Central London and joined BBC Local Radio in 1990 as a reporter, becoming BBC Environment Specialist from the period 1992 to 2001 and an environment correspondent with the BBC from 2001 to 2010. And in this context, she presented on national and international BBC radio and television news, working and winning awards across the world. Since leaving the corporation, she has had leadership roles in utilities and agriculture. She was a panel member for the National Parks Review and sat on the National Food Strategy Advisory Panel. She has served on the board of the Environment Agency and is a former director of the Oxford Farming Conference. She has incidentally also been a campaign for real ale beer judge and a rugby reporter, and I gleaned the detail that she's quite dedicated to both real ale and rugby. In 2021, she was awarded an MBE for her services to agriculture and farmer well-being. Given her expertise in environmental issues, it was an excellent choice when she was selected to become the chief executive of the Institute for Environmental Management and Assistance in 2020. The IEMA describes itself as, quote, the worldwide alliance of environment and sustainability professionals. It's a professional body for everyone working in environment and sustainability, committed to supporting, encouraging, and improving the confidence and performance of all these professionals, helping them to enhance their profile and recognition. It does this by providing resources and tools, research and knowledge sharing, along with high-quality formal training and qualification to meet the needs of members. And at the heart of the IEMA is the belief that together we can change perceptions and attitudes about the relevance and vital importance of sustainability as a progressive force for good. Now, sustainability and environmental responsibility has emerged as a crucial aspect of our thinking as a college about how we take our institutional strategy forward over the next decades. It is, shall we say, a burning imperative that we all take steps to prevent the overheating of our planet and climate breakdown, and for an educational establishment that naturally thinks in terms of the future prospects of the young people who study with us. We are conscious of the need to do and to act in the interests of the environment that sustains us. But it is also essential to communicate and to project. So what better moment to invite our alumna who has expertise in communication and environmental politics to talk to us. Please welcome Sarah Mukherjee to give this year's Lady English lecture entitled Equity, Equality and Sustainability. Has the environmental movement failed to make the case for society-wide climate action?
Principal, former Vice Principal, honoured guests, gosh, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. And I cannot begin to tell you, in fact I'm going to for the next 40 minutes, what an honour it is to be back at St Hilda's giving a lecture rather than listening to one, which was, I'll be honest, usually from my tutor telling me to do a bit more work. Looking at previous lecturers in this series, I cannot help but feel the weight of expectation bear rather heavily on my shoulders. But I hope to give you some insights gathered from years of experience as to where the environment sector is getting it right, where it's failing, and what we need to do in order to make the most of a very small window of opportunity for success. Now, if I ever thought, let me see see. Oh, there we go. That's the first slide. If I ever thought I would come back to deliver a lecture at St Hilda's whilst I was an undergraduate, I probably would have concluded that I would have been the first working-class criminal casey of colour, or perhaps a politician. I think I dodged a bullet on the last one, and I think my putative clients dodged a bullet on the first, as it was pretty clear early, and I think my former moot partner is in the audience, he'll definitely attest to that, pretty clear that forensic detail was not my strong suit. No, journalism, the big picture, that was far more me. And having said that, though, the training that a law degree affords, the ability to ingest a large amount of information very quickly, that has been a fantastically useful skill. And so any lawyers who are feeling a little bit burdened by the weight of case law, do be aware that your skills will always be useful in whatever you decide to use them in the end. Now, and you've taken page 2 of the speech, so I'll skip through this a bit quickly, but absolutely right, as Dr. Paul said, St Hilda's completely changed my life. I'm not sure what path I might have chosen if I hadn't come from my Essex Council estate, but my nan told me, as I set off for my first term, you can now look anyone in the eye. And it's absolutely true. The confidence, the intellectual rigour, the ability to work with some of the finest minds of my generation, all of this I have Oxford to thank for. And the fact that my degree was almost entirely fuelled by bacon, tomato and toast from the refectory, which I don't call it the refectory anymore, it's a canteen or something a bit more modern than that. And my time at Oxford also taught me how to deal with posh people. I vividly remember the first day after arrival and unpacking my stuff, going to Corn Market, getting my milk, my powdered milk and my coffee, all the things that you needed without refrigeration. And everywhere I heard the words, ew, hi, ew, hi, how are you? Now, these rich and rounded vowels were a million miles away from our council estate in Arlo. I just assumed that these were people coming back for their second, third and fourth years. But no, as the weeks went on, I began to realise that these people had known each other all their lives. Oxford and Cambridge was their natural progression in a life that started in immense privilege, lifting them upwards and onwards like a kind of algal mat, allowing them to rise inexorably to the top whilst indulging in the fantasy that it was entirely their own efforts that got them there. I'm delighted that the university and individual colleges, including St Hilda's, have made a concerted effort in the last decade or so to level that playing field, and that Oxford is now a better reflection of the width and breadth of intellectual excellence in this country, excellence that does not just reside in the beach and skiing holiday classes. However, it was upon leaving Oxford that I realised just how fiercely the algal mat defended itself. I'd not got into bar school for various financial and economic reasons and was at a bit of a loss as to know what to do, doing temping jobs, secretarial jobs, working in care homes, that sort of thing, whatever, as I tried to find my next stage in my career. On the way into work, reading the newspaper, as we used to do in those days. Yes, I am that old, yes. Dinosaurs were roaming the earth at the same time. You can see people think, newspaper, what's a newspaper? Something you find on your phone. I used to look with absolute amazement at the number of very average people I knew from some Oxford colleges, not this one, who were announced as the next parliamentary candidate or a senior advisor to a cabinet minister, or having just secured a prestigious fellowship at an American university. It was as if all the best stuff was somehow roped off in a VIP section that the rest of us never really got the chance to have a look at. In the end, I was very lucky to secure a scholarship to do postgraduate journalism, and from thence the BBC, and as we've heard, local and then national radio and television. Even now, I'm always amazed at the people of privilege who talk about their career trajectory as if it's something that they have control over. Mine was much more like an exercise in jumping and then clinging onto bits of wood in a fast-moving sea. We rarely talk about our failures, but I've had so many, believe me. I'm very happy to talk about those in the bar afterwards. But these failures and the ability to recover from them have given me flexibility and resilience that have held me in enormously good stead throughout my career. A career or personal fail is only a fail if you don't learn, adapt, and improve as a result. And learn I did, and after a career at the heart of environmental journalism, water policy, agriculture, and now sustainability, I would like to share with you some personal thoughts that have been marinating for the last 30 years or so. 30 years. Oh God, I'm only 35. How could I possibly be thinking about this for 30 years? My central thesis is that at a global level, the environmental community is complex, inclusive, and successful in policy terms. Whilst a bit of an alphabet soup, it's the only place that global majority people and countries have an equal voice. But this complexity turns toxic in the environment movement in the UK and Europe. It becomes a priesthood that keeps people out and results in one of the least diverse sectors across the economy. It's a luxury pursuit which is not able to engage wider society, leaving the movement and its argument open to exploitation from business as usual fossil fuel interests. I want to talk about how the environment movement has made progress globally by being inclusive and listening to global majority voices, but is failing domestically for its failure to listen and to understand societal diversity. So, where do we start? Well, after 20 years covering it, I can confirm that climate change is almost the antithesis of a good news story, and by good, I mean interesting rather than benign. The reason why so many people are hooked on real crime podcasts is the strong and satisfying sense of a narrative arc. A terrible incident, evidence and facts that you can make your own judgment on, an investigation, and hopefully the person who actually did the crime being brought to justice. Climate science is the complete opposite of this, a multiple cat's cradle of interconnections and pieces of evidence. It takes a generation for the actions that you take now to make a difference in the future. And while there's increasing clarity as to the long-term effects, there's very little clarity as to the solutions. And because it's different and nuanced and not an easy story to tell, people involved in the environment sector have been in the past very good at explaining it to each other, but not the general populace. Every sector does it, I know, but in my experience, some people in the environment movement are grand masters at slapping each other on the back whilst rolling their eyes and saying how stupid people must be not to take this stuff seriously. It's part priesthood, part Millwall supporter. I am well versed in the arcana of climate change. People don't really understand what I'm banging on about with my parts per million and average temperature rise and alphabet soup of acronyms. And so they're stupid, so I don't care. And let's face it, if you're a senior scientist or activist, when you get to the top, you probably don't want to be going to a dusty town hall to talk to ordinary people. You want to make big policy decisions at a national and international level and change the world. And so that brings us to COP, the Conference of the Parties, or the COP process. The parties being signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. I hope you're keeping up. We'll be asking questions later. An international policy meeting which may seep into your consciousness every year or so, usually in the context of, why are all those people flying around to talk about climate change? In fact, they're also flying around the world to talk about biodiversity and desertification as well, but just not quite as regularly. The Climate Change Convention was one of the trifecta of processes set up after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The summit brought together politicians, scientists, journalists and NGO leaders from 179 countries. It was only 3 years after the Berlin Wall had come down, and the feeling at the summit was a recognition that the seismic events of the previous few years should make way for a fairer and more equitable planetary governance. The conference started 3 cycles of meetings to address some of the planet's biggest issues: climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. Education, preservation of resources and participation in the sustainable economy was the daring programme of action set out at this conference. 31 years later, and the caravan of policy making continues. IEMA, the organisation I lead, is UNFCCC qualified and we have observer status, and so we can attend all plenary sessions at all the meetings, should we wish to. Each year we consider carefully whether it's worth the carbon to attend the meeting, and each year so far we have answered in the affirmative. It's much easier to meet our members who come from more than 100 countries in one location, although this year, of course, we have what some might consider peak irony, a United Nations climate change COP taking place in Dubai, built on petrodollars, the pinnacle of high consumption living with the world's only 7-star hotel. We are all thinking carefully about our attendance there, but the international chatterati flitting about to talk to each other, as my nan would have described it, is nothing new. I vividly remember watching, whilst an environment correspondent, a group of smartly suited Americans in the days of Obama, aligning diaries over what the next meetings and pre-meetings were in the cycle of conferences. Always taking place in agreeable places, this group easily threw around the names of glamorous-sounding places, Nairobi, Tokyo, Seattle, as if they were booking their next holiday, which I suspect they probably were. But do we even need all these people to reach an agreement? Well, whilst at the BBC in the 2010s, I was once asked the previous director of the United Nations Environment Programme why they'd not invested even then in more remote technology. Well, he said, somewhat surprised, people have to be face-to-face in order to make good decisions. I think the irony was lost on him, but he did have a point. The richness of a conversation or a dialogue when people are physically sitting in the same room is always going to be greater than the transactional experience of a Teams call. And when I've asked, are IEMA members in the Global South, we've got a fantastic group of members in Sub-Saharan Africa, about doing COP remotely, they've vigorously pushed back. The fragility of their telecommunications puts them at an instant and permanent disadvantage in global online conferences. A digital COP, they say, would ensure only the appearance of the best outcomes for all. Now, while it's difficult to prove a negative, I do think that the regular drumbeat of international meetings means we are further ahead in global understanding than we would have been had we not had these conferences. COP21 in Paris, another very agreeable city, in 2015 did make real progress, driven by those countries that would suffer, like the Marshall Islands, first and worst from climate change. This conference led to new international climate agreements applicable to all countries, aiming to keep global warming at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in accordance with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Another acronym, they are the scientific body that provide a lot of the data on which the COP makes their decisions. And the Paris Agreement did spark serious and radical conversations around finance. Now, I can tell you as a CEO, you can want what you like, but if the finance people are not going to let you, it's not going to happen. Anyone who's ever run or been involved in an organisation will tell you the same. It was at COP21 now. I spent so long on these slides. Let's see if this is going to work. There we go. COP21, that Mark Carney, here he goes. Is he going to move? No, he's not yet. A previous Bank of England governor and chair of the Swiss-based Financial Stability Board announced the task force on climate change related financial, wait till you see the bike, financial disclosures. That's coming, something to stay awake for. Now, this was chaired by the billionaire and former New York mayor, Michael Bloomberg, which would make recommendations mandating mandating companies to disclose their climate-related risk. So far, so peak global elite, and so old white dude, actually. But this dilemma as how to account for the negative externalities, the destruction of irreplaceable biodiversity and landscape not accounted for in traditional financial structures, well, the talking shop of COP did make TCFD happen. The UK government now has a roadmap for implementing the recommendations for TCFD. Each year in the UK, a bigger and bigger cohort of organisations is subject to this regulatory framework, and from this year, it includes regulated asset managers and other asset owners. They're expected to publish a TCFD report either within their own financial reports or as a standalone document, cross-referenced to the annual financial report. In addition to the UK, Canada, Brazil, the EU, Japan, Singapore and New Zealand are among the countries to have followed the recommendations or enacted legislation to mandate climate risk disclosure. I cannot overstate how significant and radical this is. Whatever the size of your company and wherever you are, it is more likely than not that this will be affecting you. Putting climate change on the same page, sometimes quite literally as finance, has concentrated minds in a way that few other initiatives could have done. I was speaking to a finance expert recently who said it was becoming more and more difficult to finance the back end of 25 to 30-year infrastructure projects. He was specifically talking about South America, because there was so much uncertainty about the margins you would need to consider to ensure the asset was resilient to whatever the climate could throw at it in a generation's time. That sort of thinking is really concentrating minds in the city. I know we have a lot of conversations with city analysts, and they are telling me exactly that. And while it's all a bit wonky nerdland at the moment, those who I speak to regularly who are involved in finance say it's going to be a major and radical driver of action on sustainability and climate change throughout the economy. Look, I do get that the COP process is a bit of a joke. Every year, the performative global strutting by world leaders comes down to 2 or 3 people from different countries in a room thrashing out the most granular of details. The meeting always overruns. There's always a 48-hour marathon session at the end, at which time somebody red-eyed from exhaustion emerges with a bit of paper which is instantly denounced as a failure by one section of the environmental community or the other. But it's the only global forum to make planet-scale decisions where everyone's voice counts equally, whether you are the US or an island state. Much diplomacy takes place in the self-appointed talking shops of the G20 or OPEC, but COP agreements can only be accepted by consensus. Indigenous and First Nation peoples have often led the charge in calling for faster action and, as with the Paris Agreement, have occasionally been successful. Signatories to a recent biodiversity declaration that was Montreal, another agreeable city, have agreed to directly support Indigenous peoples financially to help them save their own ecosystems. But all this, I must say, comes with a proviso. Those I speak to in the Global South and Global Majority are very clear that people in developing countries are not going to hang around forever to wait for the money to arrive, money that was promised in the case of funding for climate change, loss and damage, years ago by richer and industrialised nations to support a more equitable transition. I suspect this will be one of the key points of discord at COP this year and could, inevitably, if we don't get that right, lead to the end of the COP process. So, TCFD, the Paris Accord, it could be argued the international community is slowly getting the big things right. So why is the inference of the title of this lecture that we're all doomed to fail? Well, this brings me on to the second part of my observations for this evening. I contend that the environmental community is really good at getting the big stuff involving important people slapping each other on the backs and international frameworks delivered at global press conference really, really well, but really, really poor at articulating a message that resonates with many people, the majority, who are simply not engaged in this conversation at the moment. And that's where all this talking could ultimately fail, as the current consensus, I would contend, is far more fragile than people think. Okay, a little bit of Zen. Anthropocentrism and Judeo-Christian texts have provided a spiritual foundation for much of the progress in the global north and west that we've made in the last 200 or 300 years. Now, it would be juvenile to discount many of the advances we've made in science, medicine and technology, from life expectancy to the internet. But it's demonstrably true that by putting ourselves simultaneously at the centre and above all other living things, by destroying those creatures that do not suit us, by pulling too hard and too often on the strands that hold together the web of life, we're in danger of starting the timer on our own demise. By overusing carbon to power our way to a better tomorrow, we've made that tomorrow far worse, and in some cases, far more uncertain. I remember, whilst I was still at the BBC in the noughties, having a conversation with a researcher at the Grantham Institute, the internationally recognised climate change research scientific body based in the UK. They told me we should expect, by the 2020s, a regular summers where the temperature could reach 40 degrees Celsius. Now, at the time, I thought that sounded like dangerous alarmism. But fast forward 20 years, and our television screens are invaded on a daily basis with fires, floods, and extreme weather from all over the world. It's fair to say some of these fires have their origin in arson, but they've taken hold because of the tinder dry conditions. Indeed, a colleague of mine who works with the French government has told me there are already signs of climate-related societal movement within France itself, as people, especially the elderly, begin to search for houses further north in the face of sequential summers that have broached 40 degrees Celsius. And anyone who went out on that day when it got to 40 degrees a couple of years ago will tell you, it's not nice. This is not going on a beach holiday. It's grim, and we simply do not have the infrastructure to support it. It's only anecdotal at the moment in parts of northern France where you used to struggle to sell a house, you now struggle to buy one. But this movement within continents is something which we are ill prepared for. And it's not just migration that will have an impact driven by climate change. The transition to a lower carbon future involves access to materials that are now becoming very precious, for example, for solar panels or electric vehicles. These materials and the supply chains that deliver them are at risk from not only bad international actors, but even from climate change itself. So yes, I am absolutely aware that we are in a bad way. But I think that if all the current news has not changed your mind or behaviour, even in a small way, then the current messages are never going to work. Indeed, given the way that class and snobbery seem to overlay so much of the current public discourse, I would contend that in this context, the opposite of anthropocentrism is misanthropy. There appears to be a strand of the environmental movement that glories in all this, taking a weird delight in setting out just how dreadful it's likely to get, with apocalyptic visions of global culture wars and us all fighting each other for the last banana in the skip. But is that really going to get us anywhere meaningful? In a democracy, you are only going to get anything really done if you persuade more than 30, 40 or 50% of the people that it's a good idea. Yeah, let's go there. So, before Brexit, I worked very regularly with the European Commission as an expert panel member on a couple of Water Framework Directive committees, amongst other things. We were talking in one meeting about the amount of money needed to invest in water treatment. As you can imagine, it was absolutely eye-watering. I was making the point that in most countries, someone filling a swimming pool is paying the same marginal rate for water as someone boiling a pan for dinner, and that we should be looking at block tariffs, so you pay a really low block to begin with for your absolute essential use, and the more you use, the higher a block becomes. This also encourages water saving, of course. One young policymaker listened to the evidence and said, yes, but asking water customers to pay for improvements is only about €200 extra each year per household. Now, I don't wish to make generalisations, but an attractive salary for a European official at a fairly high level probably allows you to sleep at night whilst paying another €200 each and every year for your water. But for many families, this is completely unachievable and another example of elite thinking making bad policy choices. In the UK, some commentators have weaponised this environmental elitism, combining it with a kind of patronising snobbery. Many years ago, I interviewed the then Prince of Wales, one of the first interviews he'd done for many years. He's a great advocate of organic farming, and this was, of course, discussed as part of the conversation. One of the producers I worked with on this piece at the BBC turned to me and said, will people from council estates really know what organic food is? Well, I asked this person if they'd ever been to a council estate, and I had a slight flicker of horror. I assured her that as someone with extensive amount of practical knowledge in this space, she could rest assured that we wouldn't have to put an explanatory note for the hard of understanding. Environmentalism has also been used by some as a ducking stool or a bully pulpit, calling out anyone who buys a new pair of trousers or gets on a plane as a hypocrite or an environmental traitor. They flood their social media channels, they always have social media channels, with comments about their pre-loved this or that, but they don't mention their extensive wardrobe of couture clothes handed down by mummy or daddy, or the fact they have a second home in Cornwall or Italy, but that doesn't really count, obviously, or they already possess more furniture than they know what to do with. Food is another favoured battleground. For the sort of people who don't have to worry about where the next meal is coming from, food becomes a performative activity, something fun to do at the weekend with the added bonus of being able to look down at people for being overweight and going to McDonald's. Their lives are a far, far cry away from living in crappy rented accommodation with no cooker, 3 jobs and a couple of kids, trying to make the money in your pocket last the week, where chicken nuggets and chips are cheap and hot, and you know there will not be any waste. Moreover, a meal in McDonald's restaurant is warm, so you don't have to pay for heating, no one looks down on you, and you are no different from anyone else, however different and other you feel as soon as you get back home. But all this backslapping, all this superiority, all this judging, none of this is actually going to get us any closer to where we need to be on our collective sustainability journey. It's like going to a party and getting stuck with the guy who tells you that everything you're doing is wrong and you should be doing what they're doing instead. Well, after a couple of pints in most pubs in Harlow in 1980, they would have got the wrong end of a pool cue, as we used to say, somewhere where the sun doesn't shine. The environmental elites might think that because they had been to a very interesting dinner with a member of the shadow cabinet, and we have legislation in ensuring that climate change will have climate change action, that everything is a done deal. But let's stop for a moment and consider the fragility of that consensus. Through the Uxbridge by-election, just 500 votes separated the top 2 candidates on a day when rock-solid Conservative majorities dissolved under the weight of anti-Conservative feeling. However, in Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's old seat, the Conservative candidate won. The by-election had been dominated by the ultra-low emission zone extension proposed by the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan. Anyone who wants to drive a car that is non-compliant within the ULEZ zone will be charged £12.50 a day. The aim is to clean up London's air, and it's absolutely true. Tens of thousands of people are dying every year because of poor air quality. But the cars affected by this tax are those most likely to be owned by people on limited incomes, people for whom £60 or £70 a week is completely unaffordable. There are scrappage schemes available, but they are tiny compared to the cost of a new hybrid or electric car. And this demonstration of political will, these 500 votes, has led to a significant rowing back from both main political parties on green commitments and shown us just how fragile the political consensus around climate is. The Conservatives have taken this result and are weaving an entire political narrative around it. The Prime Minister last month thought to put some clear green water between himself and the Labour Party by kicking the introduction of electric vehicles down the road a bit and changing the rules around the change of gas boilers. He also announced he was scrapping a whole load of stuff that no one had actually made into policy in the first place, like taxing meat and forcing people to have 7 bins, apparently. The Conservatives went further at the annual conference, with the Environment Secretary promising to scrap EU laws on how bendy a banana was. Yeah, look it up, it's true. And saying they will be on the side of the motorists. And guess what? The polls previously set in concrete were beginning to slide slightly in their favour. Laws can be changed. I know many people who are not in the environmental movement who made sure I knew just how cross they were about the slow marches that Just Stop Oil has carried out so effectively in London and other cities. The passion and commitment of those taking part should not be dismissed, as I made really clear to the people I was having conversations with. They are genuinely concerned about the future of the planet, but when cyclists and environmental leaders tell them that their actions are counterproductive, maybe we should all listen. Even self-proclaimed eco-warriors like Chris Packham have said, whilst he totally sympathises with their motives, part of the movement needs to mature if it's not getting its message across. Why didn't they get a van, he asked in a recent interview in the Sunday Times, paint it orange and go round and feed the homeless instead? If you have everything, if your Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been full to the brim with food, clothing, shelter and emotional security, then denial is something different and interesting. Reducing the amount that you use or stopping doing something altogether is innovative. For those of us who started off in a background where want was more common than fulfillment, being told that something you wanted but never had is now no longer available to you is not the best way to convince you of the argument. Snoop Dogg didn't talk about getting the bus and reducing his calorie intake. He wanted to be in a chauffeur-driven limo drinking champagne. Love Island is not set in a yurt in Somerset. If the move from that should have been the title of the lecture, shouldn't it really? If the move from popular culture to international diplomacy is not too much of a stretch, the same thing is happening on a global scale, with Western governments telling First Nations and global majority nations that those in the global south should stop using the very tools that have given the developed world such a wealth of excess. And then, let's go here as well, there's flying, which we've already touched on. I've been told by many, many friends and colleagues who are working class, people of colour, or people of non-British heritage, that the obsession with flying and the hypocrisy around it has completely turned them off the environment and sustainability movement. Whilst the mainstream press feels they've got a gotcha moment if they catch a celebrity preaching about climate change and then flying off in a private jet, the message for the vast majority of people who live in any sort of diaspora is that they are going to be punished for visiting their family. One friend of mine, who's very much involved in climate finance and sustainability, is the first of his family to have been born in the UK. Everyone else is of South Asian birth. And in his words, what am I saving the planet for if you're telling me I can no longer see my family? This narrative is doing real damage to sustainability in communities of colour and is in danger of turning a very white, very middle-class profession, even whiter and posher. Research we at IEMA have done demonstrates that the environment and sustainability professions are the second least diverse in the UK, second only to farming, to give you some sort of gauge. If we are to have a chance of talking to everyone, that diversity has to change amongst people of colour and white working class communities. Now, it's obviously quite ridiculous for a businessman to fly to another capital city, sit in a room with someone else, and then fly back after 2 hours, especially when such a meeting can easily be done on Zoom. But the interactions we have at conferences and conventions, the irreplaceable moments like weddings and births and funerals that mark our existence as humans, these are things we cannot replace. And we should not dismiss the knowledge and understanding that comes from thoughtful travel. I dread to think what Sir David Attenborough's carbon footprint must be, and yet he has, more than any one individual, it could be argued, awakened us to the plight of our fragile ecosystems. Of course, we must do our best to ensure we do not destroy what we seek to protect through too much tourism or too many air miles. But at the end of the day, flying is 2% of the world's carbon emissions. Fast fashion is 10%. If you want to save the planet, perhaps start by buying fewer clothes. So, how do we get out of this pickle we're in? The one where we are simply not making the case to the majority of people that the transition to a lower carbon economy makes sense, as well as being vital for all our future survival. Well, business gets it. Use less, save more. But business leaders also know that to achieve change management is one of the most difficult things. And to get it right, you need to start with the culture, not the process. So many people in the environment movement are on broadcast mode as kind of green narcissism that brooks no dissent. But Martin Luther King did not inspire millions of people of colour by saying that he had a process they had to follow, or by telling them they were doing everything wrong. Gandhi did not need a movement and a people to independence by banging on about international frameworks. Telling people what they can't do, rather than acting and encouraging them to think about what they could do, is not a way to galvanise support. It's easy to sneer at people for thinking that climate change is a hashtag scam and the whole thing is a ludicrous fiasco. On the whole, the same people on one side sneered at the same people on the other for voting for Brexit. And yet many people voted that way for exactly the same reasons. They thought it was an expensive waste of time and someone else was getting the benefit. I spent a lot of time while I was at the BBC doing rural affairs work, talking to people in parts of the country where it seemed local and national government had completely abandoned them. Coastal areas, market towns, far away from major conurbations, where boarded up shops outnumbered the ones that were doing any business. Although this was many years before Brexit, I knew when it was announced that people would vote to leave. The benefits of Europe always seem to happen to someone else, usually the person sitting in the Eurostar business lounge, and the burdens always seem to fall on the communities like those people were living in, in the shape of fewer resources being shared around a greater number of people. I once spoke to a woman from Peterborough whose child had gone in 5 years from being in a class where there were 3 non-English speakers to one in which she was one of 3 English speakers. No one had explained to this mum why this was happening, and because her daughter was a native English speaker, she received no support in that class, despite falling further and further behind with her language. When her mum complained and asked for more support, she was told to her face by the headmistress that she was a racist, despite the fact that her concern came from a desire to see her daughter thrive, which is surely the same concern that drives any immigrant family, my own included. People who felt angry and disenfranchised and unable to make a difference went to vote to leave the EU because, as one person put it to me at the time, how much worse could my life be than it is already? And now we are creating a similar constituency who could vote away climate change consensus within a couple of elections. They feel unheard and disrespected, easily told by vested fossil fuel interests that they will be colder and poorer to satisfy the elites. They feel that the move to net zero is simply another way to empty working people's pockets of money. Buying a new electric car may feel like acceptable consumerism if you can afford to buy one, but completely and utterly unnecessary if you can't. But there is a way of creating a vision for a new net zero economy that could engage people in a way that very few political ideas do at the moment, one that involves getting back a bit of control of some of the fundamentals of life. Bit by bit, since the Industrial Revolution, we've subcontracted our hierarchy of needs. Farmers grow our foods, and increasingly restaurants prepare them. Companies build our homes, bring our cleaner water and take away our waste, and yet others supply electricity. The NHS, the police and the banks, in theory, meet our health, financial and security needs, although you may feel somewhat unsure about more of those at the moment. Now, I'm not suggesting that you set yourself up as a vigilante or a barber surgeon, but there is a way of providing a route to a lower carbon and lower impact lifestyle that is meaningful and transformative for mental and physical well-being. Let's start with food. The charity Sustain has a wealth of evidence available on the benefits of horticulture and being close to nature. It supports mental and physical health, connects communities and those from minority communities, and supports people with anxiety and depression. Why should all these benefits be to the preserve of a few who can afford gardens or who can get on the waiting list for an ever smaller number of allotments, particularly as younger people are suffering what the mental health lead for the British Medical Association has described as a mental health crisis spiralling out of control. Surely supporting those we can with green therapies is the more soluble end of this crisis. In World War II, every scrap of land was turned over to food production. Lots of locally produced fresh veg, and everyone had access to the same quality of food, leading to improvements in health and a wartime health premium that continues to be apparent today in people in their 80s and 90s. Why is the current situation, when we are spending tens of billions of pounds a year on health-related illnesses, and that is rising, why is it not urgent enough to at least consider community horticulture schemes that could reclaim bits of land for people to use and grow stuff, improve our diets, cut carbon and food miles at the same time? How about too much water? As climate change alters the rules, it'll be very difficult to present communities with hard-engineered, carbon-intensive solutions, with consultation happening at the end rather than the beginning of a process. People know what works and what needs protecting, and they want to feel part of a solution that they agree to rather than have imposed on them. My Environment Agency colleagues working on the Thames 2100 project have been doing an incredible job of consulting with a huge variety of local authorities, organisations and community leaders. Yes, it's tough, but I know it will provide valuable insights for the future. There are also some really interesting results being gathered from pilot projects that have consultation as the starting point rather than the final bit. Working with communities is hard and expensive up front, but much cheaper in the long run, as people feel they have agency in the decisions about their own community. Take energy. The UK has been really good at stimulating investment in generation from renewables, but there has not been commensurate investment in transmission networks. There is now a queue to connect more than 230 gigawatts of generation projects waiting, compared to just 80 gigawatts of generation that's currently connected. Developers are being told they can't connect until the 2030s. That slows down the net zero transition and it puts off investment. But when it comes to deciding where to put these new cables, well, as the Electricity Networks Commissioner, Nick Windsor, pointed out in a recent report, there are no agreed public rules or guidance on community benefit. So affected individuals and communities are confronted with infrastructure proposals that are difficult to understand and may bring detriment to their lives. He suggests giving them money, a real stake in the project, so they feel the benefit for suffering the inconvenience for the good of all of us. What about streets for people? Here comes the bike. Dutch activists used the energy crisis of the 1970s when some oil exporters placed embargoes on some Western countries to increase cycle use and make it easier to cycle. Now, according to figures from the bicycle network, the Dutch make 28% of trips by bicycle, covering 17.6 billion kilometres, about 3 kilometres of cycling a person a day. A lot of this work has at its root a complete change in the way most policy is developed. In this diagram of how policy is made from an Oxford University guidance note, this bit at the front, the openness to diverse voices, is missing from modern politics. The mass movements that made up political parties of the past have been replaced by smaller and smaller groups of trusted friends and allies. A recent Sunday Times article spoke of the tight-knit group of advisors around Prime Minister Sunak that are making all the decisions. He is the rule rather than the exception in modern politics. I remember finding some archived footage of a town hall meeting here in Oxford when I was looking to illustrate a television piece on the Common Agricultural Policy. I could explain that, but that's frankly another lecture, which would definitely send you all to sleep. The meeting was about whether or not to join the common market in the 1970s, and three things stuck out. Firstly, the hall was wreathed in cigarette smoke. Secondly, it was packed to the rafters in a way that modern politicians could only dream of. And thirdly, that the politician on the stage was shouting at someone in the audience, proper weapons-grade shouting. This exchange was really shocking at first, but it occurred to me that it was because each person cared about what the other said. There was no anemic or patronising nods, question time. The 1970s pair, going hammer and tongs, were of a generation that probably faced the Nazis together. And when you've put your hands in the life of a fellow soldier, it is a powerful leveller. Those men and women came back from the war determined to make life better, from better health to better access to the countryside. But that work is hard. It requires really listening. It requires giving up power. It requires allowing communities to make their own decisions about what they feel is right for the way that they live. It's hard and fragmented and takes a lot of effort to consult before a policy is developed rather than after. But wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't it be better to give people some agency? some reason to support this move to a new green economy. Buses that are not only zero emissions, but have somewhere to put the buggy, and that you don't have to take your life in your hands when you go upstairs if you have mobility issues. Public spaces that not only use lower impact materials, but which are designed to be as comfortable for a small woman of colour, nobody in particular thinking about that, as for the big white men that appear to be the pattern of the way we design, well, pretty much everything. Rebuilding local, more sustainable supply chains that keep money in the local economy. There have been some great, brilliant pilot projects in places like Totnes at a small scale, but we need to be thinking big and scale this up to make a difference for sustainability and security of supply. And jobs. Well-paid, green, skilled, permanent jobs that can happen everywhere, not just the southeast, that provide a lifetime of levelled-up economic growth, which requires a plan, a big plan for skills and training. Just to have the right number of electrical vehicle charging points, if petrol and diesel cars are to be phased out by 20, whenever really, requires an installation rate of more than 2,000 a month from today, and yet we're not simply training anything like the number of electricians we require to fill this task. But that training would say more to real people about the future of any amount than any amount of chastising them for wanting to take a holiday abroad once a year. And yet we're in the realms of magical thinking when it comes to the scale and pace of the skills we need in order to be serious about sustainability. IEMA is calling for skills and training to be incorporated in the cover text in the final document of COP28 in Dubai this year, a global signal of intent to provide skills and training for a more sustainable world. The alternative is to let others fill the vacuum. As this map from The Economist shows, far-right parties are finding their way from the fringe to the mainstream across Europe. Whilst their appeal and platform is very regional, many share climate scepticism and anti-immigration as core beliefs, in part caused by energy price rises and the subsequent campaigns by vested interests against policies that fight climate change. But this deep scepticism and hostility comes from a sense held by many working people that it's others, be they rich or immigrants, who are getting a bigger slice of what feels like a fast diminishing pie. Sitting in the meetings I sit in, I do not feel there is any sense of urgency in extending the movement's reach outside their affluent bubble. But if we don't, we're leaving ourselves at risk of collapse of a movement that has made the world a better place. By reconnecting with people, by offering a vision of a movement that makes life better, with every action taken, whilst being pragmatic about the change that we can make, we can ultimately move faster to the goals we all really want. The environment movement has been great at laying the foundations, the international exoskeleton of collective work, the regulations and data for future action. We're great at talking to each other. But we desperately need to get to the next stage in the UK and across Europe. We need the consent of the people. Unless the environment sector learns to talk with people rather than to them, the vested fossil fuel interests will exploit division to continue business as usual. I am urging you, students, the future of the movement and the hope of us all, to remember this and weave it into your own activism so we can all look forward to a democratically greener future. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for an extraordinarily stimulating talk, so full of ideas and warnings and thoughts for how we might get from where we are to somewhere else. Thank you very, very much indeed. Now we're going to have probably 15 minutes or so of questions, and we've got a starter here. Do you want to use a microphone?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I've never used one of these before. So. What a wonderful speech. You must have been lethal in moots at college. I actually have so many things to say. I'm just trying to pass it down a bit. I completely agree with so much of what you'd said. And I think one of the odd things about the vilification of obesity among the poor and the cost to the NHS is the way things have been the last 10 years. People ought to start talking about the cost to the NHS of food poverty and malnutrition. Absolutely. Because that is not going to be trivial. Totally. While I completely agree the message isn't getting out right and there is a huge diversity issue, we are building some structural problems that mean that even when the message gets heard, people won't be able to act on it. The thing that's in my mind this week is reading about the suburbanisation of poverty. That ties into cheap new housing, which isn't that effective, as well as other things. But as everybody gets pushed out of the city centre by the way that structural changes in housing benefits and council housing has developed over recent decades, without investment in giving people the choices to make eco-choices, but better bus services, supporting them to live less far away from cities, it's going to be very difficult to make any change in those kind of areas, especially as exactly the people who are getting pushed out are the people who are least likely to be able to work from home unless they're doing telephone customer service roles. So I'll pin my sort of solar farms question for you, and if there's too few later on. How do you feel about the prospect of ratcheting back those structural changes so that those on lower incomes can get supported, as with, as you said, the allotments and things, which I think is a fantastic idea, to actually be able to make those choices, and they and people with mobility issues to use the public transport and to have access to it, so that they can actually have sustainable transport instead of just getting terrified of losing their cars.
Totally, yeah. And thank you, really, really interesting points. I mean, you're right, 10.2 million people live in food poverty, which means they cannot get access to fresh fruit and vegetables without it being very, very difficult. That's 1 in 6 people, which is...
That's in this country.
That's in this country. That's in the 6th richest country in the world. We've just stopped asking people. I mean, this is a problem. We have a whole structure of regulation and decision-making that actually doesn't ask people that, and we see, people are finding more and more, what is the point of voting? I remember when I was little, you used to have 40 or 50% turnout for local elections. Now, in some parts of the country, you're struggling to get double figures, 9, 10, 11, 12%. Well, why would you? Why would you vote when every time you pull a lever, nothing actually happens? And so that's why I think, what I'm saying, and I don't underestimate the difficulty of this process. It's very, very hard. But we have to go back to starting to ask people what they want. Most people know what they need in order to make their communities, their areas better. If you take every new house as an opportunity to embed low carbon, new technology, low carbon infrastructure to make it easier, there's a village, I want to say Royston Bay, obviously it's not Royston Bay, it sounds a bit like Royston Bay. They're trying to make themselves the first low carbon village or zero carbon village. I mean, years ago, this was before anybody was really talking about zero carbon. And a lot of people used to drive to their kids to school. And they built big, wide bicycle lanes. Everybody agreed, everybody planned it, the whole community decided on what the map would be. And it just swapped. It was a bit more difficult to drive, but they appreciated some people were under real time pressure, so they've got to get the kids out to get to work. But because it was so nice, and because it was safe, everybody ended up taking their kids cycling because it was faster, it was easier. You could get, you could do, I'll do your kids one day and someone else can, it brought the community together. And that was the community planning itself. So let people get on with it. They instead of just providing, and I've seen this so many times happening, local authorities, arm's length bodies, they sit in a big room and they think about all these things that you need, and then here you are community, we're going to consult on this thing we've already decided on. Well, what's the point of that? Because nothing, I've got yes or no. It's a bit binary by that point. Instead of sitting down and saying, okay, well, what do you need? What are the outcomes you're looking for? So it's a very radical change, but I don't think we're going to get any further with this. We are simply banging our heads against the wall unless we start talking in that sort of way with humility and respect.
Do you think that devolution of powers away from Westminster would be an important step in this? I mean, in some ways, I look to, the sort of political profiles that somebody like Andy Burnham in Manchester has created, and it looks as though you've got a rhetoric, at least, which is much more about the community in the place there, and that seems to me at least a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, I certainly when I was working in the water industry, it just seems, in Scotland, for example, you could get all the people who needed to make a decision around the table, and they can make a decision. They're also much closer to their own constituencies. In Wales, I mean, I was often when you talk to the Welsh government, and a lot of people think that their Future Generations Act has been transformative, you now have to think about how you're going to affect future generations by what you're doing. You can see the Environment Minister going around Tesco's or dropping the kids off. It's a much closer relationship, and so you're getting that feedback all the time. I mean, this is no disrespect to MPs. I think they do an incredibly difficult job, but we don't have structures that make it easy for them to really have those regular feedback loops, and also to have any agency even within their own organisation. I was talking to a cabinet minister of my acquaintance recently. He said, "You've got to understand, I'm only a cabinet minister. I can't actually do anything." So there you go. And yet all you PPEists out there, that's your career directory. Hooray!
We had a question in the middle there too, behind the lady who spoke.
Yeah, hi, thanks. That was really a lot of nice detail. But I was wondering, from a big picture point of view, how far do you think, to get global ecological sustainability, how far would we have to structurally change our economic system? And if it's not a paradigm shift, if it is a paradigm shift, into what? And if it's not, how far do we have to shift what we're doing in terms of neoliberal capitalism, for instance?
Well, you could just force people to do everything immediately, but as we've seen, that comes at a cost. I mean, the point I was trying to make with that rise of the far right. A lot of far right parties are very deeply embedded with climate scepticism for all sorts of reasons. And in democracies, if you don't persuade more people than you don't that this is a good idea, then it's not going to happen. And I think we're in we assume we've got the Climate Change Act, we've got all these structures that are going to support a faster move to climate change. They could all go in an instant. So, and this is a frustrating thing, because you're absolutely right, we need quick change, but I don't think we've articulated it properly. If you talk, as I said, we have members all over the world, and talking to our members in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a completely different, the conversation is completely different. It's about governance, and their ability to actually maintain a governance structure, and also, and this, I'm actually quoting one of our colleagues in Ghana, could you please stop sending American MBAs to tell us what to do? We know what to do, what we need is we need the money and we need the empowerment to be able to do it. So there's a lot of indigenous and cultural and community knowledge that would actually help mitigate and adapt. It's not just not being allowed to flourish. Money.
No, but
Yeah.
what would happen to get the money to flow in the right
Well, that's not even happening at the moment. I mean, we COP 15 was the whole point of the Copenhagen COP was an agreement of $100 billion, $110 billion, which is probably worth half of what it was then, transition from developed countries to the global south, and there's been hardly any of it. But to do that in a way that actually got to the people who are doing, and that's, that is really difficult. It's much easier to transfer it to a single government, but what you need to do is actually transfer it directly to the communities that are making the difference. And that's, as I said, I'm not underestimating the scale of the difficulty, but it is a huge. But loss and damage will be the thing, if anything, I think, that will break up the COP process. Yeah.
Any more questions? Neil.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. One of the very local issues that I think might relate to the talk is around the low traffic neighbourhood bollards in Oxford, and it's sort of become quite a culture wars issue. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how the messaging around that or introduction of that could have been improved, for example, through citizen assemblies, such like.
Yeah, I think sometimes there is a danger that citizens' assemblies don't happen because you might have to do what the answer is. Speaking ex-communicator or still communicator, you have to, that sort of thing. I mean, I'm talking, all I know is what I've read, so I don't really know what the detail was. But it has to be done really slowly, it has to be done really incrementally, and you have to bring people along with you on the journey. There are places where that's worked really well. When we did some work with the National Food Strategy around talking to people, just talking to people about food, first of all, you have to go in there with real respect and humility and be willing to listen to people, because most people have got a really good point to make. And secondly, this whole thing about, because one of the things we asked Henry was, you've got to say, you've got to pay people more. Because actually, if you pay people more, they can have access to better food. And if you pay them more, then they actually get better food. This is a function of poverty, it's not a function. And in the same way, I mean, again, I no disrespect to the people who brought it in. I know it's a bit of a hornet's nest at the moment, but I think any scheme like that has to have a very, very long lead time, and you basically have to consult until there's no one left to consult with. Once you've got that, and then listen, and then respond. Don't just say, yeah, that's really good, and then just ignore it. You have to actually, and that sometimes is not the answer you want to hear, and that's very difficult. I have worked on projects in the water industry where you have consulted, and what you've been told is not actually what you wanted to do, but that's what was the point of consultation otherwise?
We'll have your friend, since you've spoken already.
Yes, so as I said, I've been quite closely involved in that. I stood for election as part of that. And they have consulted over and over again, and public opinion is majority in favour, but the opposition are very vigorous. Yeah. I know a number of the councillors, including the ones most closely involved in the CDN, knocked on every door in their constituency repeatedly and listened to everybody. So, and there was a citizens' assembly as part of it. And the backlash.
As I said, I'm not close to the details.
It's been supported by people from other areas, and it's become a big thing. But I just couldn't sort of listen to the sort of implication that none of that was done. Sorry. Yes.
No, I mean, as I said,
we'll leave the microphone there, because I think the lady who first spoke has a comment on this in particular.
Yes, I did. I have a slightly related comment on solar farms as well. I completely agree with my friend that there was the consultation. I think one of the problems with the LTN rollout is, as you say, nothing gets done without the money. What happened with the LTNs is there was the money, the government released projects, money for green infrastructure problems to be turned around in a really quick time frame, and they looked at what could be done, they did it, but because it was done in such a tight time frame, they didn't have time to do the messaging, they didn't have time to do the signage. It was a shock to people. People didn't feel they'd had the time to talk, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was, the shock alone to, delivery drivers, care workers, all sorts of people who are impacting. All these people who are on the marginal incomes, all of these sort of 0 hours delivery drivers, to whom the extra time turning around means that they're losing money. People working at the post office, there's a lot of things like that. But and I live in an area where the Botley West solar farm is a really hot issue, and I've been very pro, because I'm aware that this is the only solar farm of any significant size that could get off the ground in the UK before, as you say, 2035, because it's the only place where the electric infrastructure is in place already for it to work. But partly, I think, because of the housing building thing there, you'd already got a very mobilised anti-building population who are very worried about the green belt not being green and the environmental impact, and not quite as aware of the fact that solar panels are a lot more reversible than a lot of other things. So yeah, getting the messaging right and long enough in advance is key. But also, sort of, I'd wanted to say, do you see any prospect of that or other projects going forward? Because, the government has just said we're sort of like wind power, not solar power on land, in a way that I find frankly just baffling. Sorry.
Yes, this is going to sound a bit of a politician's answer, but the trouble is there is a danger of a flight from investment in all renewables until you feel that you're going to actually get your money back by being able to connect to the grid. If you can't connect, and I was talking to one renewables operator who's been told 2037. It's all built, they've spent all the money, 2037, which is, insane amount of time, and you're just not getting any money on return on your investment. That does not attract people into the industry, unfortunately.
A question at the front from the principal.
Just declaring that we're trying to set up the lodgings from being the most expensive consumer of energy into having panels on our roof, PV panels, but we're waiting for it. We haven't got permission yet, and all of those things. That's slightly frustrating. Sarah, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Huge energy. What 3 things should St Hilda's focus on to help move forward the agenda? When I say St Hilda's, we have a vast number of alumni, 8,000. We have our 600 plus students. We have rather less staff. What 3 things should we be doing, in your view, to really make a difference, to do the right things?
I would say number 1 would be to talk to your alumni of colour, of minoritised communities, of white working class communities, and ask them what they really think, because they probably won't tell you the first couple of times. We do a lot. I chair a People of Colour network in the sustainability sector, and we have very different conversations when it's just us and when there are other, slightly more privileged people in the room, because we know what we all go through, and ask them if they can speak, as ambassadors, would they be prepared to be or happy to be ambassadors? It's one by one sometimes. Secondly, talking about horticulture and allotments, is there any spare land that you could give over to a community allotment scheme in the gardens? We've got another gardening team here, I think. So I'll end up with a fork through the throat a la Midsummer Murders. And thirdly, don't waste a single milligram of food. If there's any food left over, there are lots and lots of apps now that will allow you to share it with people who are, who don't have food or are unwaged or not able to eat something. I know the catering, Lady English was saying how amazing the catering is here. If there's any way of making sure that not a single scrap of that goes into the bin and is shared with the local community. We talk a lot with organisations. We have this big conversation in IEMA. Do good companies, are good companies sustainable, or are sustainable companies good? So which comes first? But there's a lot now around social value, about what is the value you're putting back into the community in which you find yourself in. They support you through transport, through infrastructure, through education, through the people, the community that works in your organisation, and for this, take St Hilda's as an organisation. What can you put back? What are you delivering? What value are you delivering as an institution that has been here for 100 and odd years and will be here for many, many years in the future? And how do you measure that? What are the metrics you put around that? And how do you look at the end of the year and say, we have done good?
It's such a good word to end on. So we'll draw the official bit to a close there with our warmest thanks, Sarah, for all you've given us to think about and our actions to do. And what I'd like to do now is, after we've given a hearty round of applause, is invite us all out there to make sure that we drink up every drop of the drink that is out there.